Okay, guys, this is the part two of our Absolutism and Constitutionalism lecture. As we mentioned in the first part, mainly about France, the absolutist state, and England being a constitutional state, or eventually becomes a constitutional state. So we're going to look at the Glorious Revolution and the English constitutionalism in this lecture. So we're going to start off with by looking at the Stuarts and their problems. Remember, we had the Tudors. You should know who the five main Tudors are. If you don't, then you need to go back and look at your notes because we're not going to go over that right now. Okay, so we have, the first one is our James the First. Now, Elizabeth was actually, James the First succeeds Elizabeth the First. Now, James the First is actually the first Stuart. He takes the throne in 1603. And he was different, actually, than what she had been, to a large degree to some. Okay, Elizabeth had the effect of absolutionism, but James actually insists on the theory as well, and actually probably more so than any other of the monarchs during this time. Him and Charles definitely do. James, remember, is the son of the executed Mary, Queen of Scots. Remember, Elizabeth had her beheaded, and he was actually sick of rebellious Scottish nobles he had to deal with before coming to England. And the large debt that Elizabeth had created to defend England's interest was not prudently paid off. And instead, James squandered money on the lavish courts, his personal favorites, and especially, even though this is probably not politically correct to say, but to a large degree, he also spent a lot of money, an elaborate amount of money, on his homosexual lovers. Yes, James I was considered to be homosexual. Okay, not going to dwell on that one. Okay, when Parliament protested his failures to pay up his debt, James I actually just tore up the petition. He lectured them on the rights of kings. The House of Commons James was dealing with during this time, though, however, it's a lot different than the one that Henry VIII was dealing with and had terrorized into passing the Reformation a century earlier. So, the House of Commons has changed a lot over this time, especially over the term with Elizabeth as well. The members of the House had actually grown very rich on the sale of monasteries and were enjoying a new wealth through the commercial revolution that had taken place in England, mainly because of its ventures into the New World. But unfortunately, James had made a lot of enemies with these commercial classes by actually granting monopolies. And two of those main monopolies, well, there's three of them: the London Company, the Virginia Company, and the British East Indians Company. And if you're a Pirates of the Caribbean fan, you should know what the BEIC is, so the British East India Company. Remember the flag that has the BEIC on it. These were all his favorite companies, and he poured a lot of money into and gave them monopolies over anyone else. But if you remember, in a mercantilistic society, monopolies were actually encouraged, so therefore, I mean, you couldn't really fault him for that as well. Now, there was a lot of new agricultural technology. The lands began to yield much improved products. And even the landed aristocracy was much better off under James I and less likely to be pushed around as well because of the fact that they were making lots of money. You also had the religious issues that the Stuarts had. They were considered what was known as high church, kind of similar to that of the Catholic Church. They went against the wishes of the growing number of Puritans in England. Again, remember, Elizabeth doesn't really like the Puritans. James multiplies that by 100. He despises them like you wouldn't believe. You also have, during this time period, you have John Calvin, who's preaching virtues of hard work, thrift, and just being and a lot of Puritans began to follow John Calvin during this time, and they're constantly bumping heads with James over various things. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's an Archbishop of the Anglican Church, he also further ticks off the Puritans, almost in another word, and he tries to impose the elaborate architectural and rituals of basically what the same as the Catholic Church was doing, and much like France. Remember, a lot of people at this time are actually trying to mirror Louis XIV's approach to, having elaborate palaces and everything else like Versailles. But James, however, he actually views the Puritans who don't agree with him basically as being potential traitors. And then finally, in foreign policy, James flirted with Catholic sovereigns, especially with the Spanish, and he was in opposition to the policy of containment, which was basically practiced by the Tudors before him. So he has several monarchical issues that he's dealing with as he becomes the King of England. Then we have James I, who rules from 1625 to 1649. He, like all the Stuarts, he does believe in absolute royal power. But James, unlike the others, he actually lacks two things necessary to carry out all of his desires. One, he lacks a royal bureaucracy that's appointed by himself, that he put in place. And the other was a standing army to make his will felt. So he didn't have that large army that actually to enforce anything that he puts forth. As a result, he immediately has difficulties with Parliament. And in 1628, the king was made to sign a petition of rights, which basically denies the king the right to tax without Parliament consent. He can't imprison a freeman without just cause, and he couldn't quarter troops in private homes, basically meaning that troops you could not put in private homes and make them, feed them, take care of them, and everything else. And that's an important concept because that actually, you'll see that concept actually gets put into the American Bill of Rights, where we don't have to quarter soldiers as well. So that concept, a lot of these petition of rights, so they get played into the American Bill of Rights later on. You'll study that when you get to U.S. history. Now, during this time that good old Charles is king, he actually ends up raising money by a lot of illegal means. Such he collects absolute feudal laws and fines. He forces people to loan him money, and if you don't, he puts you in prison. He forces the rich to apply for knighthoods. Then he charges them for the privilege. If you want to be a knight, hey, that's a lucrative position. So he would get these people to actually apply to be a knight. Then he would charge them for the application process of doing that. So Charles has his own problems as well. Now, one of the things that Charles does eventually in the spring of 1640, Charles had to call Parliament back to raise money for his war in Scotland against the Scots, who objected to having what was known as the Anglican Book of Common Prayer forced basically down the throat. And the Parliament was actually hostile to more taxes for the king, and they basically set out to actually limit his royal authority. Now, Charles dismissed Parliament for only 3 weeks, and it actually becomes, within 3 weeks, he actually suspends them, and it actually becomes known as what became known as the Short Parliament. Excuse me. I think, I did talk about the other one too. Okay, so now before 1640, Charles runs into a major problem. He has to call Parliament back to raise money for the war in Scotland against the Scots. Okay, that's gone terribly wrong. It's become a complete military disaster in Scotland. And the members of Parliament actually take advantage of this, of the king's problems, and they force him to agree to a number of concessions, including one which he agreed to dissolve Parliament with. He could not dissolve Parliament without their consent. So in other words, no longer could he just say, you can no longer meet without our approval saying we're not going to meet. So you can imagine if you're a monarch and you believe in royal power, if you believe in royal absolute power, this flies right in the face of it. You're basically Parliament's telling you that you don't have that power. They do actually stay in session for the next 13 years, which actually they become known as the period becomes known as the Long Parliament. Now this creates all kinds of problems though. By 1642, the parliaments have gained complete control of Parliament. They drafted a document known as the Grand Remonstrance. Okay, I don't know, I'm probably saying that wrong. And which, lists a number of grievances against Charles and appealed to the public for their support, and basically going out to the public saying this is why we're doing this. And Charles actually gets very upset. I mean, again, you can see the writing on the wall. They're basically, making him a figurehead within the country. And Charles proclaims, he says, they want Charles to relinquish the military to the control of Parliament, which was a right that the king had always had. He could send his troops whenever he wanted to send his troops. And so Charles gets very upset, and Charles says, by God, not for an hour. You're not having my military for an hour. Like I said, they make the appeal for public support. And Charles, objects, and he ends up taken to the field in 1642. And that creates, unfortunately, a civil war, because you have people that sided with the king and those that didn't. And basically, remember, Cavaliers are the ones that are loyal to the King Charles I. I went over in more detail in class who these will break down, who the Cavaliers break down to. And the Roundheads, they're basically known that because of their nice little Super Bowl haircuts. They're anti-Charles I. Most of them are anti-Charles I. Puritans. Now, the Puritans, are led by an individual known as Oliver Cromwell. The war rages on for several years, for 4 years, to be exact. So you have Oliver Cromwell, but Oliver Cromwell actually raises an army, and this large army that he raises ends up defeating the king in about 1646, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. Now, unfortunately, because of Charles's defeat, he's accused of treason, and he's executed in 1649. Now, to execute your own monarch, Parliament had to be very, very careful, because people are traditionalists, and they did not think that it would be a really wise thing to do. So what actually basically Parliament does is they redefined treason to make all of Charles I's previous acts illegal. So they lay out this case before them and before the public, and they execute Charles. Now, this reigns in a time that becomes known as the Commonwealth. It's a new government. It's proceeded to abolish the monarchy and basically the House of Lords, because remember, those are all nobles. When the Parliament tried to grow rich on the spoils of defeated Cavaliers, Cromwell actually takes over, and he declares himself as Lord Protector. Now remember, Cromwell's a Puritan. He's not of noble blood. He takes over in 1653, especially when Parliament tries to disband his own army that he had raised of 50,000 experienced men. If he would, he would absolutely have to stay in power. You have to have the army to stay in power. So Cromwell becomes a ruler. Cromwell becomes, like I said, Lord Protector, a sort of a military dictator, but not a tyrant dictator as we would look at maybe in today's sense. After all, he could not veto parliamentary legislation. Parliament, at least the House of Commons, were still in place. But the threat of an army was enough to enforce his powers. Remember, he does have that one element. He does have a large army. So he does have that. So, they're not going to counter him too much because of the fact that he does have this army. Now, Cromwell has actually experienced many different difficulties as Lord Protector. As time went on, he became intolerant. He producing a backlash. The stiff-backed Puritan supporters angered the populace because, remember, that Cromwell was a very strict Puritan. He closes all the theaters, anything that had to do with entertainment. Excuse me. And he also muzzles the press. I mean, no one is allowed to speak out against him. So you don't have freedom of press either. He has foreign adventures, inflate the budget 3 times that of what Charles I had. And Cromwell savagely crushes rebellion in Ireland, leaving quite a legacy of hatred there, and it still exists to this day. And he actually did frighten a lot of the British with his own brutality. Cromwell found it impossible to reconcile the religious differences among the Puritans themselves, and the Levers and the true Puritans began major infighting amongst the Puritans. So in this chaos, the whole time this is going on, trade and commerce actually decline. So it really hurts England economically during the Commonwealth period. Now there was a gentleman, Thomas Hobbes, who stated, "During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in the conditions called war, and such a war as if of every man against every man." So Hobbes is as a philosopher. Okay, let me go back to this one. Okay, yeah, almost a little bit too far. Let me point out a couple things about Thomas Hobbes first. Okay, Thomas Hobbes writes a book called the Leviathan, which is published in 1651. And he has a view of humanity. One is equality, one is baseness. And he claims that all these traits, would naturally lead to a war of everyone against everyone unless somehow it's prevented. So what is the solution to the problem? Okay, according to Hobbes, you need an absolute ruler. The state must have supreme power. The Leviathan actually is a machine, a man-made rather than a natural creation. And the basics for this solution was scientific foundations, desire for scientific precision, and determining human affairs. Okay, so he bases a lot of it on science and drew upon various geometric models to show how it's important to have a supreme power, and everything must be in some type of order. In what ways, the question is, in what ways did Hobbes view political power different from the political philosophers from the medieval period of his day? Well, basically, he was totally secular. He rejected the idea that different classes of people should naturally fall into certain categories, and the equality of mind and talents were something he expected and feared unless it was controlled. So, what is the legacy of Hobbes? I mean, Hobbes, like I said, is a philosopher. So he makes these arguments, and these arguments become very intrinsic within the English people. So his ideas catch on, and it leads to what was kind of known as the Restoration. Now, of course, Cromwell died in 1658. The English decided they had had enough of military dictatorship, so they actually invite Charles II, who's the son of the executed king, to take the throne during what became known as the Restoration. Okay, Charles is restored in Charles II, remember that. Okay, immediately wins approval by stepping up to challenge the Dutch, who had been England's biggest foremost trading rival. London becomes the commercial and business center of the world, and Holland's defeat ended abruptly her golden age, what they were having, which had seen the emergence of people like Rembrandt. In those years, Charles kept afloat financially from money slipped to him under the table by Louis XIV of France, who thought Charles would sooner or later convert to Catholicism and return England to Catholic fold. So the concept is that Charles actually Louis XIV funds Charles II. He sends him a lot of money to shore up the business, London's businesses, and to shore up their economy. But Louis XIV is doing this because he wants England to become a Catholic nation. Now, because Charles had money from abroad, he had a little trouble with Parliament because of the fact that he didn't demand new taxes. Now, this is all being done secretly, so most of the people do not know that he's receiving this money from a Catholic nation, from a Catholic ruler, and one of which is considered their rival. So this is kept extremely secret. But most people don't really think anything about it. But Charles basically is secretly Catholic, and he does convert to Catholicism on his deathbed, and this brought his brother James II to the throne. Now, people were unhappy that Charles was a Catholic. Well, James II. Okay, that James II is a Catholic, fearing he would follow Louis XIV's example, revoking the Edict of Nays, thus ending religious toleration in England, as Louis had done, remember, already in France. So Louis had already done this. So remember how the Huguenots fled to England and spread their stories of Lewis's brutalities against the, especially the against the Protestants. Excuse me, I totally lost my place. Okay, so not only that, the fact that Charles becomes Catholic, he's Parliament excludes Catholics from office. James abhorred it in the violation of what was known as the Test Act. He began appointing Catholics to important positions in government. Now, the English government extremely upset with this. James James the Second. I'm not on the wrong slide, I don't think. Yeah, there we go. Okay, wow, just totally was off the wrong slide. Okay, brother of Charles, like I said, James II is the brother of Charles II. He's Catholic. Okay, he eventually, like I said, violates the Test Act, and James's second wife gives birth to a son, which actually now is another Catholic. Remember, James the Second is Catholic, so his son will be raised as a Catholic. Now, Parliament completely rebels against this. They're extremely upset over this because now the threat that England could become another Catholic nation. So what Parliament does? Parliament actually rebels, and they invite William of Orange, which is the husband of Mary, James's daughter by his first Protestant wife, James II, Protestant wife. Now, William had been a champion of the Protestant cause in Europe, and it actually ushers in what becomes known as the Glorious Revolution. Okay, basically what the Glorious Revolution is. Parliament redefined power between the king and Parliament. And when William becomes king, he has to accept the English Bill of Rights, which is a branch off of the Petition of Rights. Now, this document basically provides the judges were to stay in office during their tenure of good behavior and could not be removed by a king for delivering decisions he didn't agree with. In other words, just because a judge rules against what the king wants, the king can no longer replace him. There was no standing army in peacetime, so in other words, there's going to be no more Conwells around. Freedom of religion was granted to all Protestant dissenters except Unitarians, which we know that's a whole different story. And we'll get into that more probably in U.S. history. And the discussion, the concept of what the Bill of Rights, actually becomes a part of what is becomes American. So what are the impacts of the so-called Glorious Revolution? Now, the reason we say it's a so-called Glorious Revolution because technically, in a large part, it's a very peaceful revolution. It's not a war. It's not an internal civil war or anything, but it is a governmental change. So the divine rights of kings are without a doubt laid down the conditions under which kings could rule. And the kings are the divine rights of kings are discredited. And in foreign policy, it meant to switch from the pro-French foreign policy, the Stuarts, to checking the designs of Louis XIV. So in other words, the entire foreign policy also changes. The Glorious Revolution would later be justified by individuals such another great philosopher, John Locke, whose reasons would even later be used by one of our great politicians and philosophers, the large Greeks, Jefferson, especially when they were justifying the American Revolution. The role of the English gentry is vastly increased in government as well. And unlike the rest of Europe, these gentry would actually determine national policy through memberships in Parliament. And it's still that concept still exists today. So basically, what was the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution was that England reaches the height of its prosperity. The Navy, which had been built up and reorganized under the late Stuarts, becomes the primary force of the seas. New colonies, especially New Jersey and the Carolinas, were settled mainly by the English aristocracy. The Bank of England becomes one of the world's foremost financial institutions. And the crippling inflation of the last century was stopped, even though the average worker couldn't make actually a better living. So you have a new way of living for common folk. Ordinary, like I said, ordinary Englishmen are better off than anyone else in Europe. with maybe the exception of the Dutch to some degree. They enjoy better roads, they have lower taxes, they're more impartial to the judicial system. So, moreover, self-consciously thought of himself as English, was willing to fight, for liberties of the common man, I guess you could say, to some degree, anyway. Okay, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this second part. I hope you got something out of it. Take good notes, and I will see you later.